Sarah Mitchell clutched her coffee mug with both hands, trying to absorb the warmth through the porcelain as she watched the rain lash against the window of her Portland apartment. 6 years. 6 years since her twin sister Rebecca had vanished without a trace from a hostel in Granada, Nicaragua. The coffee grew cold in her hands as she once again studied the printed photos scattered across the wooden table, Rebecca smiling beside unknown backpackers, Rebecca exploring colorful markets, Rebecca hiking toward volcanic mountains with a group of tourists. The last photo was dated March 15, 2019. Her phone vibrated against the table, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah immediately recognized the international number. It was Detective Carlos Mendoza from the Granada police. "Miss Mitchell," his rough voice cut across the ocean with urgency, "you need to come to Nicaragua. We've found something." Sarah felt her stomach clench. "What? What did you find?" "A cave. In the mountains near Masaya, there were things belonging to your sister, and other things. Things that need to be seen to be understood." Silence stretched between them like a taut rope about to snap. Sarah closed her eyes, smelling the familiar scent of coffee mingling with the rain that drifted in through the slightly open window. "I'm coming." 24 hours later, Sarah stepped back onto the Managua airport tarmac, the humid Central American heat enveloping her like a stifling hug. Detective Mendoza waited in the arrivals hall, his face etched with the lines of time and tropical sun exposure. He was a short, middle-aged man with dark eyes that seemed to carry the weight of many unsolved cases. "Forgive me for bringing you here without more details," he said, as they walked toward the parking lot. "But there were things in the cave that, well, it's best you see for yourself." The drive to Granada was silent. Sarah watched the familiar landscape blur past the car window, fruit vendors on the roadside, children darting between colorful houses, distant volcanoes emerging from the morning mist, everything exactly as she remembered from her first trip, when she had come searching for Rebecca, desperate and hopeful. The cave was discovered by accident. Mendoza finally broke the silence. American spelunkers exploring the volcanic cave system near Masaya National Park, they found a hidden entrance, sealed with rocks. When they opened it, he paused, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Well, you'll see." They stopped first at the hostel where Rebecca had stayed. Casa Cosabolca was a yellow colonial building with an inner courtyard overflowing with tropical plants. Sarah recognized it immediately from the photos she'd seen hundreds of times. Maria, the owner, a 50-something Nicaraguan woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun, greeted them with a grave expression. "I never forgot your sister," Maria said, serving them strong coffee in small cups. "Rebecca was special, different from the other tourists. She spoke excellent Spanish, was interested in our culture, in our ancient traditions." "Ancient traditions?" Sarah asked, a chill crawling down her spine. Maria exchanged a meaningful glance with Mendoza. She asked a lot of questions about local legends, about the indigenous rituals that still take place in the mountains. Some tourists are interested in these things, but Rebecca, she seemed to want more than tourist curiosity. "What kind of rituals?" Sarah's voice was sharper than she intended. "Groups that preserve the ancient traditions of the original peoples. Healing ceremonies, spiritual invocations. Usually harmless, but," Maria hesitated, "there are also more extreme groups. People who mix Christianity with ancestral practices in a dangerous way." Sarah felt the coffee burn her throat. "Do you think Rebecca got involved with these groups?" "I don't know. But in the last week before she disappeared, she left early every morning and only returned at dusk, always alone, always with that look, as if she had found something she'd been searching for a long time." Mendoza leaned forward. "Maria, I need you to tell Senora Mitchell about the man." Maria sighed deeply. "There was a man who appeared here occasionally, tall, light-skinned, spoke Spanish with an American accent. He said he was an anthropologist, interested in documenting indigenous rituals. He talked a lot with Rebecca in the last weeks." "What was his name?" Sarah asked, her heart accelerating. "He said he was Dr. Thomas Kane, but I never trusted him. There was something in his eyes, something cold, The name echoed in Sarah's mind like a distant bell. Dr. Thomas Kane. She made a mental note to look him up as soon as possible. 2 hours later, Sarah stood at the entrance to a hidden cave on the volcanic slope of Messiah National Park. The smell of sulfur hung heavy in the humid air, mingling with the scent of damp earth and tropical vegetation. 3 American spelunkers waited along with 2 local police officers, all wearing safety gear and powerful headlamps. The entrance was completely sealed, explained Dr. Jennifer Hayes, one of the spelunkers. Rocks piled deliberately, not a natural collapse. When we finally managed to open it, we found a system of chambers extending hundreds of meters into the mountain. Sarah put on her helmet and adjusted her headlamp. Her hands trembled slightly as she followed the group through the narrow entrance. The air inside the cave was cool and damp, carrying echoes that turned each footstep into ghostly whispers. The first chamber was large, with a high ceiling that disappeared into darkness. The headlamps revealed cave paintings on the walls, indigenous symbols mixed with Christian images, human figures in ritualistic positions, representations of sacred serpents and birds. But it was in the center of the chamber that Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. A makeshift altar made of volcanic rocks, covered with fabrics that were once white but were now stained dark brown. Around the altar, melted candles formed mountains of solidified wax, and on a small rocky projection beside the altar, carefully arranged like sacred offerings, were Rebecca's belongings. Sarah immediately recognized Rebecca's red backpack, now faded and mildewed. Beside it lay Rebecca's digital camera, used to document her travels, the silver pendant necklace they'd bought together at a Portland craft fair, and Rebecca's brown leather journal, religiously kept since her teens. "We found more in the second chamber," Mendoza said softly, watching Sarah approach the items with reverence. Sarah picked up the journal with trembling hands. The pages were damp but legible. She opened it to the last dated entry, March 20th, 2019. "Today is the day. Dr. Kane showed me the true path. He says I was chosen, that my arrival here was no coincidence. The ceremonies these past weeks have prepared me for this. I feel a peace I've never known before. If anything happens to me, I want Sarah to know I made a choice, that I finally found a purpose greater than myself. The rebirth ritual happens tonight. When the sun rises, I will be a different person, or I will no longer be a person, but I will be free." Sarah's legs gave way. Dr. Hayes steadied her, helping her lean against a rock formation. "There's more," Mendoza said gently, "in the second chamber." The passage to the second chamber was narrow, forcing them to walk single file. The smell of sulfur intensified, mixed with something sickly sweet Sarah couldn't identify. As they emerged into the second chamber, she understood immediately why Mendoza had insisted she come in person. The chamber was smaller, more intimate. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, affixed with some kind of natural resin. All showed young women, American and European tourists, some alone, others in groups. Sarah recognized some of the faces from missing persons reports she'd obsessively researched for the past 6 years. In the center of the chamber, another altar, this one made entirely of human bones, meticulously arranged in geometric patterns. On the altar, a Bible lay open to a passage from the Book of Revelation, its pages yellowed with moisture, and nailed to the wall behind the altar, a detailed map of Central America with red dots marking locations in different countries. "How many?" Sarah whispered. "From what we've identified so far, at least 15 women have disappeared in the region in the last 10 years, Mendoza replied. "All young tourists, all traveling alone, all staying in local hostels before vanishing." Sarah approached the photographs, studying each face. Blondes, brunettes, redheads, different nationalities, but all sharing a similar expression in the photos, a glint in their eyes she recognized as hope, adventure, the thrill of discovering something new, the same expression Rebecca had in the last photos she'd sent. "This place," she said, touching the rough cave walls, "isn't just where he brought them, it's where he kept them." "We believe so," Dr. Hayes confirmed. "We found evidence that the chambers were used as living quarters for extended periods, food remnants, makeshift cooking utensils, areas that appear to have been used as sleeping quarters. And the bodies? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. We haven't found any human remains, Mendoza said. Not yet. Sarah noticed the hesitation in his voice. But there's a third chamber. Deeper. We haven't been able to fully access it yet. The entrance is partially blocked by a collapse that appears to have been intentional. At that moment, one of the local police officers rushed up, breathless. He whispered urgently in Mendoza's ear, who immediately went pale. What was it? Sarah asked, feeling the adrenaline surge. They just apprehended a man at the Managua airport trying to leave the country with a false passport, Mendoza said. Dr. Thomas Kane. The world seemed to slow around Sarah. 6 years of unanswered questions. 6 years of sleepless nights wondering what had happened to Rebecca, and finally, she was about to confront the man responsible. I want to talk to him, she said, her voice sounding firmer than she felt. Sarah, Dr. Hayes began. Maybe this isn't a good idea. I want to talk to him, Sarah repeated, this time with a determination that silenced everyone in the cave. The trip back to Granada was a blur of tropical landscapes and racing thoughts. Sarah clutched Rebecca's journal to her chest, mentally rereading each word of the last entry, the rebirth ritual. What did it mean? And why had Rebecca written with such certainty, as if she knew exactly what she was choosing? The Granada police station was a low-slung concrete building with faded blue walls. Sarah waited in a small, stuffy room, listening to the hum of a broken ceiling fan while Mendoza spoke with his superiors. When they finally called her, her hands were sweaty, and her heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Dr. Thomas Kane wasn't what she'd imagined. He was an unremarkable-looking man, perhaps in his late 40s, brown hair starting to gray at the temples, wire-rimmed glasses. He could easily have been a college professor or a librarian, but when he looked up to meet her gaze, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. There was something unsettling about his eyes, an unnatural calmness, as if he were observing her from a great emotional distance. You must be Rebecca's sister, he said, his voice smooth and polite. She spoke of you often. Sarah felt rage rise in her throat like bile. Where is my sister? Sister. Kane smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Rebecca made a choice, as did all the others. I merely showed them the way. Which way? Sarah leaned forward, her hands clenched into fists on the metal table. Which way does a 28-year-old woman disappear without a trace? The path of transcendence, Kane replied, his voice taking on an almost religious tone. You wouldn't understand. Rebecca understood. She saw beyond the limitations of mundane existence. Mendoza, who had remained silent until then, leaned forward. Mr. Kane, we've found evidence that at least 15 women disappeared after contacting you. Where are they? Kane chuckled. A low, unsettling sound. They're where they chose to be. I don't force anyone. I merely offer an alternative to those ready to receive it. What kind of alternative? Sarah asked, though a part of her didn't want to know the answer. Liberation from the endless cycle of suffering we call life, union with something greater, pure. Kane leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed despite the handcuffs. Rebecca was suffering when I met her. All of them were lost, searching for meaning in a world that offers none. I offered them something you could never offer, true peace. Sarah felt hot tears stream down her face. She wasn't suffering. Rebecca was traveling, exploring the world, living her life. Oh, but she was, wasn't she? Kane tilted his head, studying Sarah with scientific interest. Why do you think she came to Central America alone? Why was she so interested in spiritual purification rituals? Rebecca was seeking an escape from something, Sarah. Something she couldn't share even with her twin sister. Kane's words hit Sarah like physical blows. She remembered her last conversations with Rebecca before the trip, how her sister had seemed distant, troubled by something she refused to discuss. Rebecca had mentioned feeling lost and purposeless, but Sarah had assumed it was just a phase, the kind of existential questioning everyone faces at some point. You're lying, Sarah said, but her voice sounded less convincing than she'd like. Am I? Kane smiled again. Ask yourself, Sarah, why didn't Rebecca ever tell you about the emails we exchanged months before she came to Nicaragua? Why did she never mention the therapy sessions she was having, or the antidepressants she was taking? Sarah's world seemed to tilt on its axis. Rebecca taking antidepressants, emails with this man. How was that possible without her knowing? As if reading her thoughts, Kane continued. Twins always think they know each other perfectly, but the two of you weren't as close as you'd like to believe, were you? Rebecca had her secrets, just as you probably have yours. Sarah stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the concrete floor. Enough. Where is my sister? What did you do to her? Kane was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying something beyond the wall behind Sarah. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its previous religious pretense, sounding strangely empty. The third chamber in the cave. When you manage to open it, you will find your answers. Mendoza leaned forward. What's in the third chamber? The end of the journey, Kane replied simply. Before they could ask more questions, Kane requested a lawyer and refused to say anything more. Sarah left the police station feeling as if she'd run a marathon. The tropical heat of Granada hit her like a wall as she stepped onto the street, but she was still shivering. That night, alone in her room at Casa Cosabolca, Sarah finally gained access to Rebecca's email account through information Mendoza had obtained with a court order. What she found left her nauseous. Months of correspondence between Rebecca and Kane, starting as seemingly innocent discussions about anthropology and indigenous cultures, but gradually turning into something more sinister. Kane had carefully identified Rebecca's vulnerabilities, her untreated depression, her feelings of inadequacy, her desperate search for meaning, and exploited them with surgical precision. You are destined for something greater, Rebecca, he had written in one email. Your sensitive soul was not made to endure the brutality of the modern world. There are ancient traditions that offer liberation for souls like yours. Sarah read late into the night, each email revealing more about the sister she thought she knew perfectly. Rebecca had been battling suicidal thoughts, feeling overwhelmed by the pressure of her corporate law career, questioning whether her life had any real meaning, and Kane had offered her exactly what she most desperately wanted, an escape that seemed noble and full of purpose. When Sarah finally managed to sleep, her dreams were populated by images of the cave, photographs of missing women, and Kane's soft voice echoing in the rocky depths. The next day, a team of specialists had managed to partially clear the entrance to the third chamber. Sarah insisted on being present when they finally managed to open it, despite Mendoza's protests about the cave's structural safety. The third chamber was different from the other two, smaller, more natural, as if it had been formed by volcanic processes rather than excavated by humans. The air was thicker here, heavy with humidity, and something Sarah could only describe as the smell of death. In the center of the chamber was an underground lake, its black waters reflecting the light of their lanterns like a dark mirror. The walls around the lake were covered in more cave paintings, these more elaborate than the previous ones, human figures submerging into the dark waters, emerging as ethereal entities, gigantic serpents entwining female bodies in deadly embraces. My God, whispered Dr. Hayes, his lantern revealing something that silenced everyone in the cave. Along the lake's edge, arranged in ritualistic positions, were human skeletons, 15 of them, perhaps more, some still wearing fragments of clothing that had resisted decomposition. Necklaces, bracelets, and other personal effects glimmered faintly in the lantern light. Sarah approached slowly, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it echo in the cavern walls. One of the skeletons, positioned facing the lake as if in meditation, wore a familiar necklace. Sarah knelt beside the remains, her hands trembling as she touched the silver pendant she herself had helped Rebecca choose. Rebecca, she whispered, her voice cracking. Mendoza stepped closer and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. I'm so sorry, Sarah. Sarah took Rebecca's diary, which she still carried with her, and opened it to the last page. Using a flashlight, she illuminated the words her sister had written 6 years earlier. The rebirth ritual happens tonight. When the sun rises, I will be a different person, or I will no longer be a person, but I will be free. He didn't kill them, Sarah said, her voice echoing in the damp cavern. He convinced them to kill themselves. Dr. Hayes approached another skeleton and found something that caused everyone to gather around. It was a digital recorder, still functioning, despite years of dampness. With trembling hands, she pressed the play button. Rebecca's voice filled the cavern, clear and determined. My name is Rebecca Mitchell. It's March 20th, 2019, approximately midnight. If anyone finds this recording, I want you to know that I made a conscious choice. Dr. Kane showed me the truth about human existence, about the endless cycle of suffering we call life. Tonight, along with my spiritual sisters, I will participate in an ancient ritual of release. This is not suicide, it's transcendence. When our bodies cease to function, our souls will unite with the sacred waters of this cavern and find the peace we seek. The recording continued for several more minutes, Rebecca describing the months of spiritual preparation with Cain, the hallucinogenic drugs he had given them to expand their consciousnesses, the purification rituals that had gradually prepared them for the final act of liberation. Sarah switched off the recorder, unable to listen any longer. She looked around the cavern, seeing now not just skeletons but the women they once were. Young women like Rebecca, lost and vulnerable, manipulated by a man who had turned his charisma and knowledge of psychology into instruments of death. How many other places like this exist? She asked Mendoza. We're investigating. The map we found in the second chamber shows locations in Guatemala, Costa Rica, Honduras. Cain may have been active for decades. Sarah rose slowly, her knees cracking from the time spent kneeling on the damp cavern floor. She looked one last time at Rebecca's remains, memorizing the position in which her sister had chosen to spend her final moments. She was suffering, Sarah said finally, admitting something she had refused to accept for 6 years. She was really suffering, and I didn't notice. That's not your fault, Dr. Hayes said gently. People like Cain are experts at identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities. They know exactly how to approach someone who's in pain. Sarah nodded, but the guilt still weighed on her chest like a stone. How had she not realized Rebecca was battling depression? How could two people who had shared a womb, grown up side by side, shared secrets and dreams, have drifted so far apart without her noticing? When they finally emerged from the cavern, the sun was setting behind the volcanic mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Sarah breathed the fresh air gratefully, trying to clear the smell of death and dampness from her lungs. What happens now? She asked Mendoza as they walked back to the car. Cain will be tried for 15 counts of murder, although legally proving he forced these women to kill themselves will be difficult. But we have sufficient evidence of coercion, psychological manipulation, and the formation of a destructive cult. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Sarah nodded, but legal justice felt little consolation. Nothing would bring Rebecca back. Nothing would change the fact that her sister had died alone, convinced that death was her only option for peace. That night, Sarah wrote a long letter to her parents, finally telling them the truth about Rebecca's disappearance. She also began to write something else, a blog, a memorial, a warning. She wanted the world to know about men like Thomas Cain, how they operated, the signs families should watch for. If you're reading this, she wrote, and you recognize some of the signs I've described, if you have a loved one who's isolating themselves, talking about spiritual transcendence with strangers, or demonstrating a sudden interest in extreme religious rituals, please don't ignore those signs. And if this story has touched you in some way, if it's made you think about someone you love, I ask that you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. The more people who know about predators like Cain, the more lives we can save. Every subscription, every share, is a weapon against the manipulation and isolation these men use. Together, we can create a network of awareness that protects vulnerable people. 3 days later, Sarah was at the Managua airport, preparing to return to Portland. She carried with her Rebecca's diary, some of her photographs, and the silver necklace that had identified her remains. She also carried something else, a painful but necessary understanding that even the people closest to us can carry secret burdens we don't know how to share. As the plane took off, Sarah looked out the window at the volcanic mountains that had become her sister's tomb. She had finally found Rebecca, but not in the way she had dreamt of for 6 years. Instead of a joyous reunion, she had found a brutal lesson about human vulnerability and the predators who prey on it. But there was also something more, a growing determination to honor Rebecca's memory by turning her death into meaning. Sarah would start a foundation, educate people about the signs of psychological manipulation, work with international authorities to identify and capture other predators like Cain. Rebecca had searched for purpose in her life, and ironically, her death had given Sarah a purpose she never knew she had. It was a cruel and unjust exchange, but it was the only way Sarah could make sense of the devastating loss. As the plane climbed above the clouds and began its journey across the ocean, Sarah opened Rebecca's journal to the first page and began to read from the beginning. This time, she would pay attention to every word, every clue about her sister's state of mind that she had missed when she was alive. Rebecca had once written, "Sarah always believes she can save everyone. I love that about her, but sometimes I feel guilty for not being able to be saved." Sarah closed the journal and looked out the plane window. She hadn't been able to save Rebecca, but maybe she could save other women. Maybe she could turn the dark cave where her sister had died into a warning beacon that would prevent other families from going through what she had. The plane continued its journey through the night, carrying Sarah back home, but she knew that a part of her would always remain in that cave in the Nicaraguan mountains, with Rebecca and the other women who had sought transcendence and found only death. 6 years after Rebecca disappeared, Sarah finally had her answer. They were more painful than anything she had imagined, but they were hers to carry, and she would carry them with purpose, turning her sister's tragedy into a force to protect others from the darkness that had consumed Rebecca. The truth was simple and terrible. Rebecca had chosen to die because a cruel and manipulative man had convinced her that death was liberation, but even this painful truth wasn't the end of the story. 2 months after her return to the United States, Sarah received an unexpected call from Mendoza. His voice sounded different, urgent, almost whispering. "Sarah, I need to tell you something we couldn't discuss before. Something about Cain that we discovered after you left." Sarah felt her stomach clench. What? He wasn't working alone. During interrogations, he mentioned an inner circle's other people involved in what he called the Global Transcendence Projects. We found evidence of an international network. The phone almost slipped from Sarah's hands. How many people? We don't know for sure. But Cain was documenting everything, videos of the ceremonies, detailed records of his methods of persuasion, even instructions for recruiting new facilitators. Sarah, Mendoza paused. We found hidden cameras in the cave. Everything was filmed. Sarah sat heavily in her office chair, where she had spent weeks working on the website for the foundation she was creating in Rebecca's memory. You're saying my sister's death was filmed? Yes. And not just hers. Cain was selling these videos on the dark web. There's a disturbed audience for this kind of content. The information hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not only had Rebecca been manipulated to her death had been turned into entertainment for sick people. The violation seemed infinite, layer upon layer of horror she couldn't process. There's more, Mendoza continued. Cain escaped. The words echoed in Sarah's silent apartment like gunshots. How did he escape? During a transfer between prisons, 3 guards were found dead. Cain disappeared along with all the digital files that were being used as evidence. Someone on the inside helped, someone with high-level access. Sarah felt the world spin around her. Cain was free. The man who had killed her sister, who had turned her death into a spectacle, was loose again, probably already looking for new victims. Sarah knew she was stepping into a dangerous game, but she also knew that as long as Cain was free, other women would die, and she'd be damned if she let that happen. Rebecca's story had ended in that dark Nicaraguan cave, but Sarah's story, and her war against the predators who prey on human vulnerability, was just beginning. Cain had created a monster when he killed Rebecca. He'd transformed a grieving sister into something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The sun rose over Portland as Sarah finished writing her reply. For the first time in months she smiled, a cold, determined smile that Kane would recognize if he saw it. He'd sought a new victim, but he'd found his worst adversary. The hunt was on.